Hello all, I'm Kel Kidman. Welcome to Breaking on the Daily, and today we're going to talk, starting off, with COVID. The first story we have here today is from the New York Post. Quote, a drop in flu deaths may indicate that most at risk died from COVID-19. Now, this is a story with regard to the newly minted flu numbers, which are starting to go up as of recent. And right now, they are really, really low. They're down 2/3 from the 5-year average. For instance, for the week ending on October 17th, there was no flu deaths, while the 5-year average for nationally is 17. It's really, really, really low right now. Now, they say it is because of COVID and a lot of the people who would normally be susceptible to being killed by the flu being dead. I think that is partially the case. However, I don't think it explains it all. I would start by saying that there's the possibility, of course, that our testings is slightly inaccurate and that we're catching certain flu cases as COVID-19. I mean, this has been something which has been a problem. You know, they're similar diseases, no matter how much people try to deny it. They're both, airborne viruses, and they have similar DNA, if not the same, to be clear, but they are different. But beyond just the flu deaths, what I actually wanted to talk about today was the utter insanity that is lockdown policy, and how it just doesn't make logistical sense if one of your goals is to promote social distancing. And to start off, let's start with one of the most ridiculous policies I've ever seen, personally, with regard to COVID, and that is the closing down of entrances. Now, if you go to a big box store, something like a Walmart or something, at least where I'm at, they have only one entrance open, and I've seen this in a few other places as well, where they have 5 or 6 entrances normally, but in different places around the building, but have closed all of them down except one. I don't know how this makes sense if you're trying to promote social distancing, because you're having the same amount of people funnel through the building, presumably. I mean, Walmart's is, if anything, busier nowadays than it was before, which is another concept I'll get into later. But when you're funneling everyone through one entrance, when you could have two, when you have, imagine this, all right? You have 100 people just around in the area, and, you have an entrance into an area where these 100 people are going. All right. If you have 2 entrances, those 50 people more or less spread out between the 2 entrances. And you have 50 people going through one entrance and 50 people going through the other entrance. All right? That's normal times. That is without lockdown policy. With lockdown policy, you have 100 people going into one entrance that are of similar sizes, because generally with Walmart they have 2 entrances that are of similar sizes. Now let me ask you, which is more crowded? Which is harder to social distance with? Which is most likely to spread disease? Situation 1 or situation 2? Situation where there is multiple entrances, or situation where there is just one. If you answered number 2, well, congratulations, you're a public health expert apparently. You also don't understand how space works, because anyone with 2 brain cells understands that 100 people in half the space is going to be more crowded than 50 people in double than 100 people in double the space. It's just not how that works. And you could extend this down to most lockdown policies with regard to businesses and such, because when you're talking, when you close down every single businesses except for big box stores, essentially what you're doing is you're limiting the amount of places that people could be by about half, if not more. You could either be at home, or you could be in a store, or in one of 3 stores which are still open. Whereas before, you could be at a bookstore, or at your work. You could be at home. You could be at a workout place, a gym. You could be at a recreational sports area. You could be at a shooting range. You could be in all sorts of places before lockdowns. So limiting the amount of places that one potentially could be isn't promoting social distancing. It's actually limiting social distancing. It is insane to me how many people just don't understand how space works. I mean, we have this idea in our heads that lockdowns are going to limit spread because it's going to prevent people from coming into contact with each other. But that just doesn't make any sense, because it doesn't prevent people from coming into contact with each other, as is evident from the simple space analogy. If you have less space where people potentially could be, they're going to be closer together inherently. And this is why you see people, because when you have if everyone is in the same area, and the point that has been made is that if someone goes to the big box store and gets COVID at the big box store, they come back home, and everyone in that household is now guaranteed to get the virus within like a day. Probably before there is even a test, before it's even possible. Which, by the way, I would suggest is why you see in a lot of places with lockdown, you see slight spikes in cases. It's why it's so inconsistent. Because it's not that there are consistently more spikes in cases when people lock down. It's that there seems to be no correlation at all. It doesn't prevent spread. It is at best goes even. It at best goes even. But so many COVID policies are just so inane and worthless. I mean, we could go on even more to plexiglass, where we put up a panel that isn't even sealed between two booths in a freaking restaurant, And with regard to restaurants, an interesting thing that happens that has happened in my area, where most of the local and somewhat regional restaurants are all open, but the national ones aren't, is that since I work at a restaurant, I'm not going to name them here, but our restaurant has been consistently twice as busy as it was before COVID. Reason being that this portrays it perfectly. This is just anecdotal evidence, but the restaurant is consistently way more busy than it normally would be. Reason being that the people have less options. They can't go to Chick-fil-A or to McDonald's. They can't dine in any of those places because they're closed, which doesn't promote social distancing, because even before COVID, when we actually did have more, we aren't even open to full capacity, we had less people, and so it ended up being that people are closer together. There are more people in the area, in both the outside and inside place, and they're probably spreading it more than they would if everywhere was open. So there is no argument about lockdowns. I mean, lockdowns are an unproven pseudoscientific measure in the first place. They've never been tried on a large scale like it is being tried today. It's just never been tried. And I find it astonishing that we're taking our policy from China, because the reason that we even got locked down into our heads was because China did it. I mean, I don't think a lot of people realize this. That's what that is. That's what lockdown draws itself from. But going beyond that into more examples of COVID tyranny, we have an example of the police in New York, and this was on, I think, it was like the end of Friday. Beginning of Saturday, from the Young Americans for Liberty, which is where reporting this. Police in New York are now entering private residential property to crack down on Jewish gatherings. Listen to the officer explain it's a problem that he found 10 people in the house. It's truly Orwellian. Resist this tyranny. Now, I'm not going to play the video here, but it is just completely ridiculous, because this police officer, who seems to be an absolute scumbag. I'm not a huge fan of NYPD specifically, and I'm still a fan of the police as a general idea, but man, you guys just gotta stop doing this sort of unconstitutional nonsense. But in this case, he walks in and he sees more than 10 people and is like, okay, we're gonna have to do something. He doesn't really even explain what is going to be done, or what the law that has been broken by him seeing 10 people in a room. And just, man, I mean, how insane have we gone? Especially when the responses to this are like, so many responses to this are like, man, the American people are so selfish for wanting to have more than 10 people in a gathering. It's just, it is really depressing. Well, it's not particularly depressing when you see a lot of these people are from Europe. Europe, yeah. So it's not as surprising. I mean, they have made the entire last century a crusade against constitutional rights, fundamental rights. Another example of a Jewish, another example of Jewish anti-Semitism. Rioters, for this from Daily Wire, rioters attacked Jews for Trump convoy in New York City. Pelt cars with objects. I mean, we just have more and more of this sort of thing happening. You also had examples of riots, anti-lockdown riots starting. I think these are legitimate, a lot more than the, vague racial justice riots that we've had over the past few months. Yet even then, don't riot. Don't riot. I mean, rioting is not a good idea. You shouldn't do it. But to go on to some leftist hope, we have a story here of Trump issues sweeping order stripping job protections for tens of thousands of federal employees. This one's fun. This one is fun. This one is fun. We have here from Stars and Stripes. And we'll read from this. Quote, President Donald Trump fired his biggest broadside yet this week against the federal bureaucracy. He has moved to remake with an executive order that would remove job security from an estimated tens of thousands of civil servants. Oh, the libertarian in me is screaming in delight. I mean, I don't think it's arguable at this point. I think Donald Trump is by far the most libertarian president we have had in decades. I mean, I think he beats out Reagan. He's certainly the most federalist president we've had in decades, since Eisenhower, at least. I mean, the COVID issue alone is just a great example of Trump not doing any sort of federal overreach. It's great. Wonderful. And this guy has been great on these sorts of issues. So, get back to it. The directive issued Wednesday strips long-held civil service protections from employees whose work involves policymaking, allowing them to be dismissed with little cause or recourse. Thank you. Thank you, Trump. Please keep doing this. Much like the political appointees who come and go with each administration, which is exactly how all of this should work. The executive branch is the executive branch, all right? It's owned by the executive being the president. If the president can't fire anyone in the executive branch he wants, is it still the executive branch? I mean, another thing where I've seen the most inane arguments with people claiming, oh, this is authoritarian. What? What? Him saying, oh, I want to fire federal employees, which are all these bureaucrats, all these authoritarian bureaucrats who think that they know better for everyone and that there's a scientific way for governance, which is inane, because governance is about philosophy. Fundamentally, it's about philosophy. It's not about science. It's not about the outcomes necessarily. It's about the process. It's about rights. Rights aren't evident in science. I mean, they kind of are, but that's only if you believe them to be valuable in and of themselves, which you need to believe not on a subjective level, but on a non-scientific level. You can't prove the value of rights. And this is fundamental to all governance, all of governance. So the idea of scientific governance is just one of the most authoritarian ideas ever. And the idea that, you see this is authoritarian coming from a lot of libertarian socialists, which, by the way, is an oxymoron. I mean, if your position requires that people do what you want and do what the government wants, and requires large amounts of government control, you're not a libertarian. Simple as that. Simple as that. And that's what libertarian socialism inherently requires, that sort of thing. Simply because if you want to enforce it on a large scale, above a commune, essentially, you have to have government control. You have to dictate it from the top down. It's not going to work that way. But that's a very, very much a heartwarming story to me that government employees can now be fired more easily. To go on to the next story, Biden in either gaffe or Freddie and Slip says he has created the most extensive and inclusive voter fraud organization in American politics. This guy's really fun. I'm gonna be sad when we're no longer running against him. And this is from Fox News. People have been like, "Oh, it's just a gaffe. He's just, he's just saying this and he's wrong." I think, I don't know. I could go either way on thinking it's a gaffe or a Freudian slip. It's one or the other, and it's either the biggest dimensional moment he's had. I mean, I think it's worth it to mention, he doesn't stumble over his words here. It's just all, it's all just speech. He's just saying it, and it looks like he's as if he's reading off something, and he's not stumbling at all. It's just, it's not like the other dimensional moments he's had. I wouldn't say for sure it's a Freudian slip, but, it's at least iffy. It's at least iffy on that point. Next up, another Biden story. He is called Trump supporters who were heckling him at his rally, who were drowning him out. He called them those chumps. I think, while this doesn't go up to the level of deplorables back in 2016, it definitely gets close. And I think what people are underestimating is that Biden is not a nice guy. I mean, he is not a nice person. If you watched him even debate Sarah Palin and Paul Ryan, the guy is vindictive. Like, he treats people like children a lot of the time. I mean, and you can go back to, "Oh, if you don't vote for me, you're not black." All of these sorts of statements he's made in the past, where he just treats people like they're children. And he does this all the time. It's all over the place in his speaking style, and you can definitely get him to do that, especially if he gets angry. He did it a lot in the debate. I mean, you see where he was snickering the entire time and just saying that's false without any evidence. And I think that's one of Biden's biggest weaknesses, is that he is not as nice as he presents himself to be. He is really a vindictive person. Anyway, on to the next story from the Daily Caller. Exclusive, we got a sneak peek at Trump's 2020 census data. Admin recorded highest number of households in the past 30 years. This is quite interesting. The 2020 census is, of course, late at this point. COVID prevented them from really doing anything until June. But the interesting thing here is that the 2020 census has approximately 152 million American households. And I'm going to be interested to see how that equates to population growth, because we might be getting to the point where we have an average household, average household size of like 2 or 3. And I think that's worrying, because families are really important, And I do think it's worrying because, well, the more you have families, the more conservative are. That's just from a pragmatic standpoint. But more generally, more philosophically, having a family is very important from a mental standpoint. I mean, it is very much a stabilizing force, even if it doesn't seem so in the moment. Having a family can help you not be as insane. And, this can be very much worrying. But on top of this, with the Census Bureau, they have gotten a lot. It is quite impressive how many people they ended up getting. They said they have accounted for 99.98% of all U.S. households. And we still don't necessarily know whether illegals are going to be counted in the census. And if they are counted in the census, it's going to be completely ridiculous, because it's going to inflate blue state numbers in a lot of areas, because a lot of illegals live in blue states, because in sanctuary cities and the like. And that's worrying, because when you that's an outsized proportion of the population. Not the first time that Democrats have wanted to count non-voting populations as their non-voting populations for their census, but you know that's how that's functioning. I guess I do think it's ridiculous that the court has blocked these sorts of things. Though it is going to be put up to the court, and I think it's with Amy Barrett, who, by the way, is being confirmed today. She might have been confirmed by the time this video actually goes up. The reason I'm not talking about it, I don't really care. I mean, I'll talk about it later. Essentially, I don't really have a whole lot to talk about. Same with the Hunter Biden story. The reason I'm not talking about the Hunter Biden story is because I don't really care about the less vicious nature of the new revelations. There's some new revelations that are actually interesting to me. The corruption stuff that's going to be coming out pretty soon here. I think it's either today or tomorrow. And I'll be talking about that, but I'm not going to be talking about it on its own just because I don't really have anything to talk about. But anyway, on to our last story. The U.S. FCC has a U.S. FCC lawyer has said the agency can change rules on social media liability shield. This is really encouraging, because if Trump gets another term and we start getting this out, we're going to get another net neutrality meltdown of 2017 again. Which, by the way, I thought that was supposed to kill us all. I think it's pretty much fine at this point. It's been in place for like a year and a half at this point, and I don't think there's been any real detrimental effects. I think I've been vindicated on this point. So anyway, this goes back to July, where President Donald Trump, his administration, asked the agency to limit the protections for social media companies under Section 230, and the FCC General Counsel said that the scope of Section 230 immunity must be interpreted by someone. The only question is whether the FCC or a federal court will do the interpreting. And an FCC lawyer, as of today, it has stated that they can change these liability regulations. And this is really, really good. This is really good. Good news. And I think if we continue to go to get more updates on this information, you know, we're going to start seeing less and less social media censorship if we start treating them like platforms, or like more accurately like publishers when they act like publishers, and treat them like platforms when they act like platforms. We actually make that distinction, and we make that distinction meaningful. I'm really encouraged by this, and I think you should be too. I'm going to leave you off there. I'm Kel Kidman. This has been Breaking on the Daily. I'm out.